History remembers Henry VIII as the king who broke England from the Catholic Church. But behind the throne, his legacy is far more disturbing. This was a ruler whose sexual obsession destroyed 6 women's lives, turning the royal marriage bed into a chamber of fear. He demanded virgin brides, subjected them to humiliating inspections, and measured their worth only by the sons they could give him. Those who failed were cast aside, disgraced, or executed, their bodies broken beneath the weight of one man's lust for power and control. Tonight, we uncover the most horrifying sexual cruelties of Henry VIII, the king who turned desire into death. Henry VIII was not merely a monarch obsessed with power. He was a man consumed by sexual insecurity. From the beginning of his reign in 1509, he believed that God had chosen him not only to rule but to reproduce, to father a line of strong sons who would guarantee the Tudor dynasty's survival. Yet, beneath this divine belief, Henry's relationship with women was already poisoned by his own obsession. Unlike his contemporaries, who often took discreet mistresses, Henry placed women at the center of his political and spiritual battles. His bedchamber became a stage for dynastic theater, where the queen's role was reduced to that of a submissive virgin bride, her body valued only for its ability to produce heirs. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, entered the marriage after years of political delay. She was older than Henry and had been briefly wed to his older brother, Arthur. For a man obsessed with purity, the marriage began under the shadow of suspicion. Henry demanded that Catherine swear she had never consummated her union with Arthur. In doing so, the king revealed his most haunting preoccupation. Virginity was not merely a personal matter, but a state affair. Henry's anxiety over sexual purity extended into ritualized humiliation. Court gossip whispered of physicians and matrons being tasked to confirm the virginity of royal brides. In Catherine's case, her oath of chastity was enough to satisfy the church and allow the marriage, but for Henry, this planted the first seed of obsession. If a woman's worth began with her untouched body, then her failure to give him sons would be seen as both a betrayal of duty and a corruption of purity. As the years passed, Catherine endured 6 pregnancies. 5 ended in stillbirth or infant death. Only 1 child survived, Mary, the daughter who would later become Queen of England. But to Henry, Mary's survival was not triumph, it was humiliation. A female heir was not enough to secure the throne in his eyes. Each miscarriage, each small coffin carried out of the royal nursery, deepened his resentment. At court, Henry still displayed the outward charm of a golden king, tall, handsome, athletic, admired for his music and wit. But in private, Catherine bore the weight of his shifting moods. He accused her of failing in her wifely duty, though it was just as likely that his own health problems, from a possible genetic blood disorder to untreated infections, caused the repeated tragedies. Yet, in his mind, the fault always lay with the woman. This was the cruel pattern of Henry's life. The sexual expectations placed on women were absolute, while his own failures, impotence, disease, or paranoia were hidden behind the shield of kingship. Queens were expected to remain virgins until they married him, remain submissive in bed, and remain fertile for sons. If they failed, they became enemies. By the mid-1520s, Henry's obsession with replacing Catherine was consuming him. He had become fixated on a younger woman at court, Anne Boleyn. She refused to become his mistress, insisting that she would only give herself to him as a wife. For Henry, this denial became intoxicating. The pursuit of Anne turned from lust to madness, reshaping religion, politics, and history itself. But at its core, the story was not about religion or empire. It was about Henry's dark desires. His belief that women owed him virginity, obedience, and sons, and his willingness to destroy anyone who denied him. Catherine of Aragon's humiliation would be only the first of many sacrifices to Henry's sexual obsession. In Henry's world, love was never enough. Virginity was a weapon, fertility a test, and queens who failed were reduced to shadows waiting for their executioner. The Golden King of England was already becoming a tyrant of the bedchamber. Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon began with promise, but by the 1520s, it had become a theater of cruelty. Catherine was the daughter of Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella, a woman of immense dignity and religious devotion. She was no common queen consort. She had been bred to embody virtue, obedience, and piety. But to Henry, all of these qualities mattered little compared to one single measure of her worth: the production of a healthy son. Over the years, Catherine carried the weight of 6 pregnancies. Each one brought hope, prayers whispered by courtiers, and the eager preparations for a prince who never came. One child, a boy named Henry, lived only a few weeks before dying in infancy. 4 others were stillborn. Only one child survived to adulthood, Mary. Born in 1516, in a cruel twist of irony, the daughter who survived would one day rule as Queen Mary I. Yet to Henry, her very existence was a constant reminder of failure. The court whispered in pity as Catherine endured miscarriage after miscarriage. But for Henry, pity hardened into resentment. He saw his queen as cursed, her body incapable of fulfilling its duty. The grief of lost children was not shared, it was weaponized. Catherine mourned as a mother. Henry judged as a king. In Tudor England, a woman's body was her currency. Virginity was a prized commodity for the marriage bed, but once a wife, fertility was the sole measure of value. Sexual purity mattered only until the wedding night. After that, the queen's entire purpose was to give her husband sons. Catherine's inability to provide male heirs was treated not as tragic misfortune, but as betrayal. This cruelty deepened in the bedroom. Though Henry and Catherine continued their conjugal life, the intimacy grew cold. Henry's sexual appetite shifted elsewhere, to younger women at court, to mistresses whose youth and beauty mocked Catherine's aging figure. Catherine, ever dignified, never publicly spoke of her husband's infidelities, but humiliation was her constant companion. To share a bed with Henry was no longer a privilege but a duty, overshadowed by the reminder of her repeated failures. It was not only the Queen who suffered. England itself trembled with the consequences of Henry's obsession. Without a male heir, the Tudor dynasty seemed fragile. Memories of the Wars of the Roses were still fresh, a reminder of how disputed succession could plunge the kingdom into chaos. Every miscarriage became not just a personal loss, but a national crisis. Henry's cruelty sharpened as he sought divine explanations. He turned to scripture, to priests, to astrologers. One verse in Leviticus tormented him: "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." To Henry, Catherine's first marriage to his late brother Arthur became a haunting shadow. Though she had sworn their union was never consummated, Henry convinced himself that God was punishing him for marrying her. This interpretation, whether born of genuine belief or desperate excuse, provided the justification he craved to discard her. By the mid-1520s, Catherine was aging. Her body, worn by pregnancies and miscarriages, no longer represented the youthful fertility Henry desired. Her face lined with sorrow, she became the silent witness of her husband's growing obsession with Anne Boleyn. The once beloved queen was now reduced to a relic of failure. Yet, despite Henry's cruelty, Catherine remained defiant. She refused to step aside, refused to acknowledge herself as anything less than Henry's rightful wife. When the king began seeking annulment, Catherine fought him with a dignity that outshone his rage. She declared her marriage valid before God, swearing once more that her body had been untouched during her first union with Arthur. But her voice, however noble, could not silence Henry's ambition. This was the turning point where private obsession became public catastrophe. To rid himself of Catherine, Henry would defy the Pope, tear England from Rome, and plunge his kingdom into religious upheaval. But at its heart, The crisis was not about church authority, it was about a woman's womb. Catherine's tragedy was that her worth as a wife, as a queen, and as a woman had been measured only by bloodlines. Her years of loyalty, her devotion, her sacrifices meant nothing in the face of Henry's obsession with a male heir. The king's cruelty was not just in words or in politics, but in the quiet humiliation of a woman who had given her life to him, only to be cast aside as barren. By 1533, Henry declared his marriage to Catherine invalid. She was banished from court, separated from her daughter Mary, and confined to remote castles. Alone, grieving, and ill, Catherine clung to her faith until her death in 1536. She was denied the dignity of burial as queen. Buried instead as the Dowager Princess of Wales, a final insult from the husband who had once sworn eternal love. Catherine of Aragon was not destroyed by swords or fire, but by something colder, the slow cruelty of being deemed useless in a marriage built on obsession. For Henry, her womb was a battlefield. For Catherine, it was a graveyard of hopes. Anne Boleyn did not enter Henry VIII's life as a passive figure. She was young, ambitious, and unlike most women at court, she refused to submit to the king's advances. In an age when kings could take mistresses without consequence, Anne's resistance was both daring and dangerous. She demanded that Henry make her his wife, not his concubine. What began as lust for a clever, dark-eyed courtier transformed into an obsession that changed the course of England's history. For nearly 7 years, Henry pursued her. He wrote letters filled with passion, yearning for her body, confessing his torment at being denied. But Anne would not yield. She knew the price of becoming a mistress. Discarded women filled the court, forgotten once their beauty faded. Anne's strategy was both her weapon and her curse. She would remain untouched until she wore the crown itself. This denial was intoxicating for Henry. His desire for Anne grew so great that it overshadowed his kingdom. He broke with the Pope, declared himself head of the Church of England, and forced his subjects to accept his authority in matters of faith, all for the right to lie with Anne as his queen. Sexual obsession had become national crisis, and Anne stood at the center. In 1533, Henry married Anne in secret. She was crowned queen, and soon after she became pregnant. The king believed God had rewarded his sacrifice, that at last the male heir he had sought for decades was about to arrive. Yet, in September, the child born was a girl, Elizabeth. Though Elizabeth would one day be one of England's greatest rulers, at that moment she was nothing but disappointment to Henry. Anne's relationship with Henry quickly darkened. Her sharp wit, which had once captivated him, became unbearable. She challenged him in ways no other queen dared, refusing to submit completely. Their once burning passion became a battlefield of suspicion, jealousy, and unmet expectations. Anne bore Henry 2 or 3 more pregnancies, but all ended in miscarriage. In 1536, she suffered her final loss, a stillborn boy. To Henry, this was the ultimate betrayal. He convinced himself that Anne had bewitched him, that she was cursed, that her failure to produce a son was a divine sign that their marriage was invalid. From there, Anne's downfall unfolded with ruthless speed. Henry's ministers, eager to please their king, constructed a case so grotesque that it shocks even centuries later. Anne was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Incest, treason, and sexual perversion. The charges were designed not only to end Anne's life, but to destroy her reputation forever. The trial was a spectacle. Anne stood before her accusers, calm and dignified, declaring her innocence. But guilt had already been decided. The testimonies of tortured servants and terrified courtiers sealed her fate. The verdict was death. Henry, once the lover who had risked excommunication for her, signed the order with cold resolve. He even arranged for a French swordsman to be brought to England, ensuring a swift execution by blade rather than the clumsier axe, a gesture some saw as mercy. others as cruelty, a final performance of control over her body. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold within the Tower of London. Dressed in a dark gown, she addressed the crowd with humility, praising the king and asking God's forgiveness. Not once did she protest the obscenity of the charges. Perhaps she knew the futility. Perhaps her silence was her final act of defiance. When the sword struck, her head fell in a single blow. The woman who had once been the most desired figure in England was gone, reduced to a cautionary tale. Henry, untroubled, married Jane Seymour within weeks. Anne's story was not only one of betrayal, but of sexual politics turned deadly. She had used her chastity as leverage, forcing Henry to marry her. In doing so, she had rewritten the rules of power between men and women. But the same strategy that elevated her also doomed her. To Henry, a woman's value was measured by her sexual availability and her fertility. Once Anne had surrendered her virginity and failed to deliver sons, she became expendable. What makes Anne's fate most horrifying is not simply her death, but the way her sexuality was weaponized against her. She was condemned not for treason in the political sense, but for alleged crimes of the flesh: lust, incest, adultery. Her body, once desired, became the evidence of her guilt. Her fall revealed the terrifying truth of Henry's reign. To share his bed was to share in mortal danger. Queens were exalted only while they pleased him. Once they failed, in the bedroom or in the birthing chamber, their lives could end on the executioner's block. Anne Boleyn had been courted as a prize, pursued with relentless passion, and crowned in triumph. But in Henry's world, love was a transaction, and passion was disposable. Her head rolled not only for politics, but because she could not turn desire into a son. In the aftermath of Anne Boleyn's execution, England's court barely paused to grieve. Henry VIII, ever restless in his appetites, already had his next bride waiting in the shadows. Jane Seymour, a quiet and obedient lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, had caught the king's eye. Where Anne was fiery, Jane was submissive. Where Catherine had defied, Jane bent. Henry, exhausted by years of defiance and disappointment, saw in her the perfect vessel for his most desperate hope, a legitimate male heir. Jane's family understood the stakes. They encouraged her to remain chaste until Henry made her queen, learning from the fate of Anne Boleyn. Virginity, once again, became Jane's currency. Courtiers whispered of stolen moments between Henry and Jane, hands clasped, furtive glances, but she never allowed him her bed. Her refusal was not rebellion but calculation. She would give herself only as a wife, ensuring her security. Henry, still haunted by Anne's sharp tongue and accusations, found Jane's quiet demeanor intoxicating. He described her as gentle and as meek as a lamb. Yet beneath this image lay the cruel truth. Jane's obedience was not choice but survival. To deny the king entirely was dangerous, but to surrender too quickly was ruin. She walked a razor's edge, knowing that her future and her life depended on it. Just 11 days after Anne's beheading, Jane was betrothed to Henry. Their wedding followed soon after. The speed of the union was shocking, a public display of how replaceable queens had become. For Henry, Jane was not a wife chosen out of love, but a womb chosen for utility. Within months, Jane was pregnant. The court buzzed with anticipation. Henry's sexual obsession was not with Jane herself, but with the possibility of what her body might deliver. Physicians, astrologers, and midwives surrounded her, interpreting every sign as proof of a coming prince. The kingdom, weary of uncertainty, prayed for a male heir. In October 1537, Jane went into labor. It lasted 3 days and 3 nights, an ordeal that pushed her body beyond its limits. At last she gave birth to a boy, Edward, the long-awaited Tudor prince. Bells rang across England, bonfires lit the night, and Henry wept tears of triumph. At last he had what Catherine and Anne had denied him, a son who would secure his dynasty. For Jane, however, the triumph was fleeting. Her labor left her torn, weak, and vulnerable to infection. Within 12 days, she was dead. The queen who had given Henry his most prized possession paid for it with her life. Henry's grief was unlike anything he had shown for Catherine or Anne. He mourned Jane deeply, calling her his true wife. Yet, even in his grief, his cruelty was revealed. For Henry, Jane was perfect not because of who she was, but because she had fulfilled her sole purpose. She had given him a son, and in death, she became an untouchable ideal, a virgin wife who became mother, yet never lived long enough to challenge him. Sexual detail shadows Jane's story in the silence of her marriage bed. Unlike Anne, she never used passion as a weapon. Unlike Catherine, she never argued her virtue. She existed only as the obedient partner who satisfied Henry's desire for purity and fertility. But this obedience came at the highest price. Her sexuality was never her own. It belonged to the king, to the state, to the future of the Tudor dynasty. Her body was consumed by childbirth, her death a reminder of the brutal cost of reproduction in a world where women were valued only as bearers of sons. Henry ordered Jane buried at Windsor Castle, in the very chapel where he too would later lie. No other wife would be granted such an honor. In death, Jane became the sainted figure Henry could worship, the quiet queen who had given him everything and asked for nothing. The irony, of course, was that she had no chance to ask. Jane Seymour's tragedy lies not in scandal or execution, but in her erasure. She was remembered not for her mind, her will, or her desires, but solely for her womb. Her story is the cruelest confirmation of Henry's obsession, that a woman's entire worth could be reduced to the production of a single son. Jane Seymour achieved what no other wife could. She satisfied Henry's lust for an heir. Yet her victory was also her death sentence. In the shadows of triumph, her body became another casualty of a king's unrelenting obsession with bloodlines. By 1539, Henry VIII was nearly 50, obese, and plagued by ulcers and impotence. Yet his obsession with control extended into the marriage bed. After Jane Seymour's death, the king's advisors sought another wife to secure alliances. They chose Anne of Cleves, a German noblewoman whose marriage could strengthen ties with Protestant states. Henry, ever insecure about appearances, relied on a portrait painted by Hans Holbein. The likeness flattered Anne, and Henry, convinced she was beautiful, agreed to the match. But when he met her in person, he recoiled. He complained bitterly to his courtiers, calling her the Flanders Mare. The disgust was immediate, humiliating, and brutally public. Henry's rejection was not private cruelty. It became an open humiliation for Anne. On their wedding night, Henry attempted to consummate the marriage, but later confessed he could not perform. He told his physicians and advisors that Anne's body repulsed him, describing her breasts as sagging and her figure unappealing. Yet in truth, it may have been Henry's failing health, not Anne's body, that caused his impotence. The irony is that Anne had no power in this union. She had crossed the sea to marry a king, only to be stripped of dignity by his words. Her virginity, so prized before marriage, became her only salvation. Because the marriage was never consummated, Henry declared it invalid within 6 months. To her credit, Anne survived what destroyed other queens. She accepted the annulment gracefully, taking the title of the king's beloved sister. She remained in England with wealth, lands, and independence that no other wife of Henry would enjoy. Yet her survival came only through humiliation, branded as undesirable, discarded without hesitation. Anne's story exposes another side of Henry's obsession. His cruelty was not always execution or exile. Sometimes it was the sheer indignity of being reduced to flesh judged unworthy of his touch. Sexual failure, whether Anne's supposed unattractiveness or Henry's impotence, was made into a weapon of shame. Anne of Cleves escaped with her head intact, but not her dignity. In Henry's court, a woman's value lay in her body's ability to please the king. When it did not, her worth dissolved into humiliation. In 1540, Henry VIII, aged and diseased, turned his attention to Catherine Howard, a girl barely in her teens, cousin to Anne Boleyn. Where Anne of Cleves had failed to ignite his failing passions, Catherine's youth revived them. Courtiers described her as lively, flirtatious, and unworldly. To Henry, she was not just a bride, but a symbol of renewed virility. The king showered her with gifts, jewels, gowns, estates. He called her his rose without a thorn. Yet behind courtly flattery lay a disturbing reality. Catherine had little choice. She was married off to a man nearly 30 years her senior, whose body was bloated, ulcerous, and plagued by pain. Their nights together were celebrated by Henry's court as a sign that the old king still had power between the sheets. But for Catherine, those same nights may have been a private nightmare. Unlike Henry's earlier wives, Catherine carried the scars of a difficult past. Raised in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, she had already been exposed to sexual advances as a child. Her relationships with men like Henry Manox and Francis Derham before her marriage were less choices than pressures, born of vulnerability in a predatory environment. Yet once she became queen, those past encounters became deadly secrets. Henry's passion for her was obsessive, but the young queen's flirtations with courtier Thomas Culpeper drew suspicion. Whispers circulated of secret meetings, stolen moments, and reckless notes exchanged. Whether love or desperation, Catherine's involvement with Culpeper sealed her fate. In 1541, her past and present collided. Evidence of her premarital liaisons and her affair with Culpeper was presented to Henry. The king, once deliriously infatuated, turned on her with savage betrayal. His humiliation was unbearable. He, the all-powerful king, had been made a cuckold by a child bride. Catherine was arrested, interrogated, and condemned. Her words, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," were whispered among those present, though never confirmed. On February 13, 1542, Catherine was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. She was no more than 19. Witnesses said she appeared terrified, barely able to stand. Her final moments contrasted sharply with Anne Boleyn's dignified composure. Catherine was a child caught in a man's brutal game of power and lust. Her body was buried near Anne's in the Tower of London, another victim of Henry's insatiable desires. The same sexual obsession that elevated her to a throne now reduced her to a corpse, erased by the blade. Catherine Howard's tragedy was not simply her betrayal. It was the cruelty of a world where a child could be married to a monstrous king, where innocence was consumed by lust, and where a girl's laughter became a death sentence. Catherine Parr was unlike any of Henry's previous wives. When she married the king in 1543, she was 31 years old, a widow twice over, intelligent, pious, and politically astute. Unlike Catherine Howard's youth or Anne of Cleves's humiliation, Parr's power came from her mind. Yet even intelligence was a dangerous quality in Henry's court, especially when it touched matters of sex, religion, and loyalty. Henry was nearing the end of his life. His body was failing, his temper more volatile than ever. He was no longer a king of virility, but of suspicion and cruelty. Catherine Parr entered his life as both nurse and wife. She cleaned his festering ulcers, comforted him during his rages, and endured his demands for obedience. But beneath the surface, she nurtured ambitions for reform, for influence, for a voice in a man's kingdom. Parr's sexuality, unlike his other wives, was not the focus of Henry's obsession. Instead, it was her independence of thought that enticed and unsettled him. She engaged him in theological debates, pushing Protestant reforms in subtle ways. Yet in a court where heresy and treason were interchangeable, these conversations were as dangerous as any illicit affair. In 1546, conservative enemies at court persuaded Henry that Parr was becoming too bold. They accused her of heresy, pointing to books she read and discussions she held with reformist scholars. A warrant for her arrest was drawn. For Catherine, the fate of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard loomed over her, both women silenced by the executioner's blade. But Parr survived by using the very weapon Henry valued most, submission. When the king confronted her, she cleverly reframed their debates as mere attempts to distract him from pain and offer comfort. "I am but a woman, made to learn from my lord," she reportedly said. Her humility flattered Henry's ego, disarming his rage. The warrant was quietly withdrawn. She had, for the moment, escaped the Tower. Catherine's survival is remarkable not because Henry loved her more, but because she adapted. Where others resisted, she yielded. Where others sought passion, she offered patience. Where others fell victim to his obsessions, she endured them. When Henry finally died in 1547, Catherine Parr became the first queen to outlive him. Yet even her freedom was bittersweet. She remarried for love to Thomas Seymour, but her story ended in tragedy, dying in childbirth at just 36. Even in survival, the curse of Henry's wives clung to her: marriage, lust, and death, bound inseparably. Catherine Parr's triumph was survival, but at a cost. In Henry's court, even intelligence could be a death sentence, and only submission preserved her life. She outlived the king, but never the shadow of his cruelty. By the 1540s, Henry VIII was no longer the vibrant king who had once dazzled Europe. The man who had danced, jousted, and seduced with ease was now grotesquely transformed. Obesity had consumed him. His waistline measured over 50 inches. Ulcers on his legs festered with pus, filling his chambers with a stench his courtiers could not escape. Beneath his robes, he was rotting alive. Yet what disturbed his court most was not his physical decay, but his unquenchable lust and paranoia. Despite his failing body, Henry's obsession with sex and virility endured. Physicians prescribed potions and stimulants to rouse his failing manhood, and courtiers whispered of servants tasked with preparing his body for intimacy with his wives. His pride demanded that he remain a man of sexual dominance, even as age made the act itself increasingly difficult. The contradiction between desire and impotence fueled his cruelty. Each wife's failure to excite him, each suspected betrayal, became proof of treachery rather than a reflection of his own decline. Anne of Cleves had been shamed, Catherine Howard beheaded, and Catherine Parr nearly destroyed, not only for politics, but because Henry's masculinity was slipping beyond repair. His mental state followed his body's ruin. The once confident monarch became paranoid, convinced that betrayal lurked in every shadow. Friends of decades were executed on suspicion alone. Nobles were dragged to the block for imagined slights. Henry's sexual failures fed this suspicion. He could not accept weakness within himself, so he projected it onto others, particularly the women closest to him. Eyewitnesses described the king as monstrous in size and temper. He lashed out at courtiers, smashing dishes and threatening execution for trivial disobedience. His bedchamber, once the center of seduction and power, became a place of dread, where physicians lanced his sores and wives endured a husband whose touch had turned from pleasure to burden. The irony of Henry's later years was cruel. The king who had torn England from the Catholic Church for the sake of passion now found himself trapped in a body unfit for desire. His court could see it plainly. The great Henry VIII, who had executed wives for failing to produce heirs or satisfy his lust, could no longer command even his own flesh. When he died in 1547, England's throne passed to his sickly son Edward. Henry left behind not only a fractured kingdom, but a legacy of cruelty born of obsession, impotence, and madness. His decline revealed the truth, that behind every act of brutality lay a desperate man fighting against his own mortality. Henry's cruelty was not only the story of a king's power, but of his terror at losing control of his throne, his body, and his lust. In the end, it was not his enemies who destroyed him, but his own decaying flesh. Henry VIII's cruelty did not end with his wives. His children bore the scars of his obsessions, political, sexual, and religious. Each was shaped not by love, but by the relentless pursuit of power that destroyed their mothers. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, suffered most from Henry's rejection of her mother. Declared illegitimate after the annulment, she was stripped of her title, forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, and pressured to denounce her mother as unlawful. For years, Mary endured humiliation, isolation, and threats of execution. The trauma hardened her into the queen history remembers as Bloody Mary, unleashing her father's brutality upon others. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, grew up with the shadow of her mother's execution hanging over her. Declared a bastard at 3, she learned to survive by silence and calculation. Every move in her youth was haunted by the blade that had ended Anne's life. Elizabeth's reign would later reflect her father's cunning, but also his ruthlessness, honed by years of fear. Edward, Jane Seymour's only son and Henry's long-awaited heir, inherited a kingdom already fractured by his father's sexual and religious tyranny. Sickly from birth, Edward became the tool of ambitious men who sought to control England through him. His short reign was marked by fragility, a child king struggling beneath the crushing weight of Henry's legacy. Even Henry Fitzroy, his illegitimate son by Elizabeth Blount, was not spared. Though recognized and granted titles, Fitzroy died young, a reminder of Henry's desperation for heirs and his disregard for the lives he disrupted in pursuit of them. The tragedy of Henry's children lay not only in their suffering but in their inheritance. Each carried the mark of a father whose sexual obsessions destroyed mothers, families, and the kingdom itself. Love was absent. Only survival remained. Henry VIII left behind more than a dynasty, he left a curse. His children ruled not as symbols of renewal, but as broken heirs to a legacy forged in lust, betrayal, and blood. Even in death, Henry VIII's body reflected his monstrous decline. By January 1547, he was too weak to speak, and courtiers feared uttering the truth. The king was dying. His swollen frame could barely be moved, his ulcers unhealed, his flesh breaking under its own weight. When the body was transported to Windsor for burial, a grotesque scene unfolded. The coffin, hastily sealed, began to leak. Chroniclers recorded that fluids seeped onto the church floor, a macabre symbol of the corruption that had defined his reign. To some, it was divine judgment, the great king reduced to decay before reaching his grave. Yet Henry's burial was lavish. Beneath the pomp of banners and prayers lay the stark truth. A man who had destroyed wives, friends, and children was honored as God's anointed ruler. His tomb, meant to house his glory, became instead a silent monument to lust and cruelty. Henry's body collapsed under the weight of his appetites. His corpse rotted as his kingdom bled, leaving England to wrestle with the ruin he left behind. Henry's reign did not end with his death. It lingered in the memory of those who had lived beneath his tyranny. Fear had become the currency of his court. Ministers, nobles, even family members knew one misstep could lead to torture or execution. The culture of suspicion he created endured. The Tower of London, once a fortress, had become a slaughterhouse of queens and courtiers alike. Families were torn apart by charges of treason and heresy. The nation itself bore scars. Monasteries dissolved, land seized, traditions uprooted. For the common people, Henry's marriages and executions were not distant dramas. They reshaped religion, reordered society, and left England divided. The blood spilled in his bedchamber and on the scaffold shaped not only dynastic politics, but the very soul of the realm. Henry's lusts were not private sins. They were national tragedies. His bed decided the fate of a kingdom, and his cruelty became the people's inheritance. Henry VIII's story remains one of history's most horrifying examples of power twisted by obsession. His marriages, 6 in total, were not tales of love but of domination, humiliation, and blood. Sexual desire became a weapon. The throne itself became a stage for cruelty. Each queen was trapped in a cycle of seduction and destruction. Catherine of Aragon discarded, Anne Boleyn executed, Jane Seymour dead in childbirth, Anne of Cleves humiliated, Catherine Howard beheaded, Catherine Parr narrowly surviving. The pattern was unmistakable. Women were prizes until they failed to please, then they became expendable. But Henry's sexual tyranny reached beyond his wives. His daughters grew into broken rulers, his son into a fragile king, his people into witnesses of endless blood. What began as a man's desire ended as a nation's suffering. The lesson of Henry's reign is not only about monarchy, but about humanity. When lust is fused with absolute power, it corrodes love, family, and even faith. In Henry's England, sex was not intimacy, it was politics, punishment, and death. Henry VIII's legacy is not the glory of kingship, but the warning of tyranny. His story reminds us how quickly passion becomes cruelty, and how entire nations can bleed for the obsessions of one man.